Okay, so first of all, good evening everyone, and welcome to what is a webinar form of our third Ithaas event. If we haven't met before, my name is Kamal Singh, and today I will be taking you through the Gadar Party Chronicles from Punjab to North America. Now, in the next 40 minutes to an hour or so, I'll be trying to cover about 20 years worth of history. So bear with me. I'll try to keep it at a gentle, enjoyable pace for all. Something different in this talk, which we haven't done in the last talks, is that there will be questions throughout the talk for everyone to get involved in and to keep you thinking about what we're talking about. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, I thought we'd just take a moment to discuss what our aim is for today. Now, we can think about Sikh history on a bit of a timeline, and on this timeline we can plot a few points based on familiarity. I'm sure we're all really familiar with the time of the Gurus. We know that this was followed by a time of the Sikh Empire, which really led into a period of independence in 1947 following British rule, and then really the story of modern Sikh struggles in which we find ourselves today. We can see ourselves that there are numerous periods on this timeline that we know very little about. The aim for tonight is hopefully to start building some foundation in this history to help us all to get a completer understanding of our story. And it's a story which through only 500 years is incredibly rich and diverse. One key element of that story can be found in this time period, and that element is that of the Gadar party. Now, today my aim is not to give you a complete and comprehensive overview of everything that the Gadar party achieved, because that would take too long. Really, my aim is to give you a snapshot, to show you where the areas of controversy are, to show you what we know now, hopefully to raise a few questions in your head and to motivate you to go find answers to those questions. In simple terms, if all of that is a little bit too confusing for you, really, by the end of this talk, this should not be the picture which comes into your mind when I say the word Gadar, because of course this is not Gadar. This should be the picture which comes into your mind, and you'll find out what this is as the talk continues. So really, the story of Gadar is the story of Punjabi migration. We need to go back to the Punjab of the early 1900s and consider why people were leaving the state and, on a broader level, the country. Historians interested in this area really write that there were two groups of people leaving Punjab and India at this time. The first group were the revolutionary freedom fighters. The majority of these fighters were from relatively well-off middle-class families, and quite a percentage had actually been educated in prestigious institutions in England, where they'd been exposed to a differing form of democracy and government from what you would find in British India. Now, as you might expect, however, they found no place to develop and espouse their views in India under the British government. By the 1900s, the British had been in power for just under 50 years in India, and following the Indian Mutiny of 1857, they passed a number of laws to really strengthen their control in India. And these laws limited the ability of people to gather to discuss seditious ideas. They limited what could be published in newspapers and in other forms of written communication, including books, journals, letters. And it's because of this that revolutionaries at this time, such as Lala Hardayal, start to leave Punjab and India more broadly. Lala Hardayal is important to our story, and we'll encounter him again towards the end. Now, the other group of migrants out of Punjab at this time are the average Punjabi. And just like any migrant, the reasons for them leaving their homeland are complex. In this case, most would agree that the key reason they left Punjab was for economic gain. But other push factors included natural disasters. Famine was not all that uncommon in Punjab at this time, the British taxation system, and the policies of the Raj. Now, if we think about economics in Punjab at this time, it does then, as it does now, come down to land. Now, Khushwant Singh describes this issue quite detailed in his book, A History of the Sikhs. The British approach to agriculture in Punjab at this time was one of investment to try and increase food output. With such investment came a significant increase in the price of land as the ability to make money off this land increased, and so did the demand for such land. In fact, the price of your average Punjabi acre went from 10 rupees in 1870 to 100 rupees in 1900. Now, of course, this isn't tangible money which people have, but it does go into their assets. And the thing with assets is that they increase your credit worthiness. So your average Punjabi farmer is now more likely to get a loan from their friendly neighbourhood loan agent, commonly referred to as the Bania or the Artia in Punjab. Now, under the effect of stringent land taxes enforced by the British, a greater and greater number of farmers began to access these loans to pay their dues, especially in years where they may not have achieved the expected crop outputs, or there may have been natural disasters to limit how much money they could actually make from their agriculture. Now, unfortunately, this meant that the farmer in Punjab found himself to be more and more heavily indebted. And in an administration where there was a significant degree of corruption and legal power sat with the Bania or the Artia, unpaid loans quickly resulted in a loss of land for the farmer. Now, the scale of land being lost by farmers due to an inability to pay loans was actually quite incredible at this time. Fauja Singh describes this in quite a bit of detail in his book, The Effects of Land Transfer, and he mentions that the total figure of repossessed land because of unpaid loans in Punjab in 1870 to 1871 was 1.2 million acres. By 1891, this figure had increased to 4 million acres. Particularly affected were the central Punjabi regions, which tended to be more prosperous, including Ludhiana, Jalandhar, Hoshiarpur, Firozpur, Amritsar, and in pre-partition Punjab, Lahore. Now, to most of us, 4 million acres of land sounds like a substantial piece of territory, but to give us an idea of how big it actually is, this is 4 million acres of land represented on the present-day map of Punjab, so we can really appreciate it is quite a substantial piece of land. Now, those who had been dispossessed of their land were being forced to look for livelihoods elsewhere at this stage. In fact, a significant number at this time turned to labour for other landholders. The number of landless peasants turning to labour for people who were currently landed increased by almost 360% between 1872 and 1903. So the effect of what was going on in Punjab was quite significant on the average Punjabi farmer. But to put it in the words of the Financial Commissioner of Punjab at the time, over large areas the peasantry was already ruined beyond redemption. And so it's in this sort of a climate that the average Punjabi, whether dispossessed or not, begins to look for opportunities elsewhere, outside the seemingly constrictive policies of the Raj and outside India, where some of them find themselves with absolutely nothing. Now, it became commonplace for those who were aiming for greener pastures elsewhere to sell any land they may have left, to mortgage assets, to sell gold and jewellery, to actually borrow money from friends and family and wherever else they could actually get it to raise money for their journey overseas. Now, when we start to think about where Indian and Punjabi migrants were heading, this is the sort of list that we can end up making. At the top of the list would be Canada, and particularly the territory of British Columbia. Further down the list you'd find places like the US, especially along the Pacific coast because of its temperature and climate similarities with Punjab. You'll also notice there are a number of Southeast Asian destinations on the list. Australia has made the list, but only just. There are only ever very few documented entries of Punjabis and Indians into Australia at this time. East and Central Africa tends to feature quite heavily, and this is really the beginnings of the large Sikh communities that we see flourish in Uganda and Kenya. The Caribbean tends to feature quite heavily as well. But from here, really, Canada becomes a key focus for our talk, and it's a key focus for migration from Punjab in the early 1900s. I don't want to mislead people here into thinking that Every man and his dog was trying to move into Canada at this time. To quote numbers from the Mackenzie report commissioned into Indian migration to Canada, the total number of Indians who moved to Canada between 1905 and 1908 was 5,179. Now, perhaps significantly for us, 75% of these were Sikh and 50% were former officers in the British Army. Now, the reason that they were selecting Canada was relatively straightforward. Canada at this time was a territory of the British Empire, and being born in India, the migrants moving to Canada were subjects of the British Empire. And so according to the Constitution of the British Empire, any subject of the British Empire born in any other part of the empire is entitled to the same freedom of movement, to full rights and liberties in all other parts of the empire. And so it was expected that Canada would uphold this agreement, at least on paper. Now, what they found when they actually moved to Canada could not have been more different. In fact, one can almost draw quite a few parallels between the insular and essentially xenophobic policies of white Canada with those of white Australia that some of us may have studied in high school. To highlight this point, this is a song from Khushwant Singh and Satindra Singh's book, which featured heavily in political gatherings and union meetings of that time. I refer you particularly to the mention of these lines: "To Oriental grasp and greed, we'll surrender, no never, because of course white Canada forever." This early period of Sikh migration is also where we start to see the media adopt their attitude towards the new arrivals. This is a picture from the Canadian magazine The Pacific Monthly of May 1907. It shows Sikh employees of a lumber mill in Port Moody. Now, while the caption reads quite positive, that many of these men are ex-soldiers and they are hardy and they are courageous, the title, "The Hindu Invasion," highlights the xenophobic nature of this article and the fear of the other. Now, one point to mention here is that the majority of the Sikhs moving to Canada at that time were referred to as Hindus, not so much from a religious point of view, but more that anybody from India at that time was referred to as a Hindu. Now, the longer these men stayed in Canada, the more they began to see the challenges that they were facing. In terms of employment, the majority were able to access menial, hard, physical work which had been rejected by the locals. This was very different to Sikhs in other parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, where Sikhs had been known to adopt professional pursuits such as being policemen or teachers. These avenues were not open to Sikhs at this time in Canada. And though their working conditions were quite difficult and physical, nothing compared to their living conditions. Now, nothing describes this better than a quote from Barclay and Singh. So in this quote, they are describing a wretched tenement, so essentially an old factory which has been condemned by health authorities, which is where Sikh migrants are living. And to give you a picture of how bad these conditions were, it's been described as a combination of Libby Prison, the Black Hole of Calcutta, with a little touch of Dante's Inferno and a free fight thrown in, as if to say just for good measure. Perhaps most concerningly for the local white Canadian, these men were not averse to such difficult conditions. They comprised ex-soldiers, and they were happy to work at an average wage of $1 to $1.25 per day, and in doing so, they undercut the local worker by about 25%, making them much more appealing to a potential employer. Now, up until now, we've actually covered quite a significant story tracing people's movement from Punjab all the way up to Canada. And these challenges that they confronted were quite incredible. The resilience that these men showed is actually very admirable. And it's a shame that it hasn't featured more frequently in our popular culture. And this brings us to our first question. Satinder Sartaaj actually wrote a very nice poem describing these challenges. Perhaps you can actually think of its name. If you haven't thought of its name, the answer to this question is Mola Ji, which literally means God. It's a poem in which Sartaj is writing from the perspective of a Sikh migrant to Canada who is describing the difficulties he is having in adjusting into life in Canada. Now, if anybody is interested in this and interested in reflections of these challenges, I strongly recommend you YouTube Molaji and have a look at the video. These are some stills from that video. It shows Sartaj working in the lumber industry, which was quite common for Sikhs at that time, and attired in the clothes that Sikhs would have worn in Canada at that time. So of course you can imagine that it's really only a matter of time before a response from the local Canadians comes to protect their wages. And the first lobbying that we see against official Sikh migration comes from the trade union movement, and the government is very sympathetic to their demands. Canada as a port for Punjabis begins to shut its doors gradually. In 1907, the sum of money that had to be in the possession of an intending migrant to Canada went from $25 to $200. Now, $25 was perhaps within the reach of most Punjabi migrants aiming to go to Canada. $200, however, was well beyond their capacity. Interestingly enough, this change was almost solely for Punjabi and Indian migrants. Those from Japan or China only had to show $50. The reason for this, I'll leave you to think about. In 1908, we see the introduction of perhaps the most famous of all the early Canadian anti-immigration laws, what came to be known as the Continuous Travel Law. What this meant was that one would only be permitted to travel and enter into Canada if they had arrived by a continuous journey from their country of birth or citizenship, with no stops on the way. And the ticket for this journey had to also be purchased in this aforementioned country. If that's all a little bit too complicated, really what it meant was that for Punjabi migrants, the usual route of coming into Canada, going through Hong Kong, going through Shanghai, going through Singapore, and then coming into Vancouver, really became off limits. The other thing to note at this time, and you may have actually already noticed this, in all the pictures that we've seen of early Sikh migrants, there are only men. Family reunion in Canada at this time was banned as an attempt to limit the growth of this migrant community. In fact, between 1905 and 1940, there are only 9 documented entries of Punjabi women into Canada. And how they managed to get in is interesting in itself. You'd have to look at it case by case, and some of these references here would help you to do so. And I strongly urge, if anybody has an interest in this, to follow it up. Now, as if this politics of exclusion that we're seeing wasn't enough, the Canadian government devised another solution to its problem. To give you an idea of how the government was thinking at this time, it proposed a destination for the deportation of Indians from Canada. Now, this is a multiple choice question. I'll give you some time to think about it. The 4 choices here: did the Canadian government think of sending them to Australia? Was the plan to return them to India? Was it to send them to the relatively backward and very underdeveloped country of Honduras? Or was it to go south down North America into Mexico? So if you've had a think about it, the answer is actually Honduras, of all places. And the story goes that a delegation of 2 local white politicians and 2 members of the Sikh community did visit Honduras to assess its viability. When they saw living conditions in Honduras, the Sikh community downright rejected the idea of moving there. And this quote shows the discussions that were had between Teja Singh, who was a leader of the Sikh community at the time, and General Swain, who represented the Canadian government. And it highlights how the Sikh community at this time felt they were in a good position. They didn't want to leave British Columbia. And most concerningly for the Canadian government and for the British government in India, they felt if they tried to force Sikhs out of Canada, it would result in a mutiny of Sikh soldiers in India, which would become quite difficult to try and control. And so we see the Canadian government back down from this view. But really, what they tried to achieve through all of these policies, they got to. Because if we have a look at the number of Indians migrating to Canada between 1909 and 1920, the number drops to 118. Recall that between 1905 and 1908, the number of migrants into Canada from India is as high as 5,179. There are quite a few years here where you'll notice that there is actually no migration of Sikhs into Canada at all. 1914 is an exception, and there's a reason for this. We'll talk about it as it comes. So it's really in this sort of a climate in Canada that animosity at the treatment faced by the early settlers into Canada begins to grow. And the main reasons for this, as you may have already guessed, really are the denial of rights as subjects of the British Empire, a lack of legal pathways to improve their situation, and a relative lack of support from Britain and the rest of the empire itself. And this is particularly distressing for the community because it is constituted heavily by ex-soldiers who felt that they had provided quite a degree of loyalty to the empire and therefore deserved some degree of loyalty in return. But they found that that was not forthcoming. Their attitudes at this time and the attitudes of the rest of the Sikh community in Canada at this time actually become clear in Gadar Party poetry, which of course at this stage is still to come in the future. But this translated line really does enforce their attitudes. So it says, harassed in our own land with no support available abroad, we aliens have no land that we can call our own. Now, if you were paying attention, and I assume that you all eagerly were, you would have noticed that this was the first time I actually mentioned the word Gadar since the start of the talk. It would be amiss of us to continue from this stage without actually talking about the etymology and the meaning of the word Gadar, which is something for you to think about. So Gadar is actually a Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, it really does go across all of the North Indian languages, word which is derived from Arabic, which means revolt or revolution. And really the first time that we start to see it used is in the first newspaper of the Gadar Party. The newspaper is called Gadar. And the word is used by this man, who is of course Kartar Singh Sarabha. In his lines he writes, "Today there begins Gadar, in foreign lands but in our country's tongue, a war against the British Raj." So the use of the word from an Indian language is symbolic for the Gadarites. It represents a fight against the British Raj. But coming back to the story that we're following now, at this stage the official party known as the Gadar Party has not formed. Discontent at the treatment faced by early Sikh settlers in Canada is being expressed at a key institution of the community, the Gurdwara. Now, 3 early Gurdwaras had already been established in Canada by this time. They included Port Moody in 1907, Ross Street, Vancouver soon after, and following this, Victoria 1912. Now, Port Moody was run by the Khalsa Diwan Society, which actually became quite an important organisation in the struggle for early rights. To give you an idea of how much support this struggle for early rights was receiving from this Canadian Sikh community, all we have to do is look at the donations to the Khalsa Diwan Society between 1908 and 1920. Considering that $200 was enough to turn most potential migrants away at this time, the figure of $295,000 raised by a community which numbers only 5,000 is actually quite substantial when you do the maths. You see that this money went for a wide variety of different causes, but particularly political causes, whether it was paying sufferers of massacres, whether it was providing some relief to sufferers from political activities or families of political prisoners, deportation cases, fighting immigration cases, or more significant cases like the Gamagata Maru case, which we will come to. Now, the discontent within the system and the desire for reform now begins to adopt a more official form. We get into the establishment of the organisation which would later popularly come to be called Gadar. Officially, the name of the Gadar Party is the Hindustani Workers of the Pacific Coast, referred to in other pieces of literature as the Hindi Association of the Pacific Coast, and you may see a number of other terms also used to describe it. The first thing to note is that the organisation was formed in the US, but mainly through the support of aggrieved Canadian Sikhs. The US emerges as an obvious choice for the side of the party because having defeated British rule itself, unlike Canada, it is much more accommodating of such radical views and much more likely to allow such a party to flourish. Now, as to exactly how and where this organisation formed, this is complex. There is no simple answer. Depending on where one reads, you will get differing interpretations. The story seems to be that one of the first meetings of the party took place in Portland, Oregon, between Sohn Singh Bhakna and Udham Singh Gadar, both prominent Gadarites in the party to come. In fact, Portland actually celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Gadar movement in 2013 and does lay some claim to its formation. From here, a subsequent meeting is said to be held between these two and Gadar Singh in Astoria, also in the state of Oregon. Now, Astoria also lays claim to the formation of the party. Then, in an effort to unite with other Sikhs in California, an official meeting is held in Stockton, just outside San Francisco. A date of April 21, 1913 is thrown around in sources as the date of this meeting. This is the first meeting where we see the involvement of Gadarites like Lala Hardayal and Kartar Singh Sarabha. The Stockton Gurdwara, one of the earliest in the States, also lays claim to being the point of formation of the party. What we do know really, regardless of where it was formed, is that the party headquarters are then moved into San Francisco, at 436 Hill Street, San Francisco, a building also known as the Yugantar Ashram, which is an important term for later on, from where they ultimately moved to 5 Wood Street, San Francisco, where they will stay for the rest of the Gadar Party's life. Now, if that slide confused you, please don't be. Studying the Gadar Party, its literature and its activities are recognized to be quite difficult. And the reason for this is that the headquarters of the party were demolished in the 1950s and all early records of the party were moved to a farmhouse in Davis, California, which, as luck would have it, was destroyed by a fire and so took essentially all of those early records forever. So our understanding of the party is really based on preserved court documents when Gadarites face trials. They're based on memoirs, the recollections of Gadarites, and the Gadar literature, which is key because it gives us a first-hand account of the philosophy of the party. Now, if we come back to this Gadar party, wherever it was initially formed, we can say that it had 30 founding members, which included this list of prominent individuals. You might recognize a few of these names from earlier in the presentation. We mentioned Sohn Singh Bhakna, who becomes the president of the party. Gadar Singh is the vice president. Lala Hardayal becomes the secretary and the editor of the Urdu form of the Gadar newspaper. Kartar Singh Sarabha becomes the same, but for the Punjabi form of the Gadar newspaper. And we could continue down this list announcing them, but I'm sure you can just have a read there. The one thing that you will notice as you continue down this list is that this list actually contains a mixture of names of people who look like they've come from differing parts of the Indian community. Unlike all previous nationalistic movements, Gadar was not religiously based. Even though its membership was chiefly Sikh, it was not actually a Sikh religious organisation, and that's one thing to think about, because thinking of it as a Sikh religious organisation would actually ignore the critical contributions of other communities, particularly visionaries like Lala Hardayal, who's often considered to be the brains behind Gadar. Lala Hardayal was a particularly important visionary for the movement, and he recognized the role of education in changing the future of India. And as part of his legacy, before he left the US in 1914, he actually established a scholarship at the University of California. Now, this question does ask you to think of its name, but it's not really something we hear about, so it's not that fair of a question. The scholarship, as maybe few of you may know, is actually called the Guru Gobind Singh Ji Scholarship. It's worth $30,000 and it pays for a graduate student from British India, so present-day Pakistan or India, to come to University of California, Berkeley and study. It was established in conjunction with Baba Jawaharlal Singh, who becomes quite a key member of the Gadar Party later on, but at that time was a prosperous farmer in California. Now, last I heard, it was going strong till 2013, where it was actually temporarily suspended. More details of this can be found at this website, but I'm not sure when it will be restarted. It did, however, go strong for 100 years, which is very, very good. Now, on to the aims of the party. The aims were probably best summarized by this quote from Gadar Singh Saraba. So, what is our name? Gadar, so revolution. What is our work? Gadar, revolution. Where will this revolution be? In India. And the time will soon come when rifles and blood will take the place of pens and ink. In other words, the Gadarites wished to set up an organization which initially would focus on the production of inflammatory and revolutionary literature, which would build a revolution against the British in India and bring people to the point of armed revolution, which is where the Gadar party leaders would go and give direction to such a revolution and ultimately overthrow the British in India through the use of rifles and blood. Effectively, what the party had achieved was that it had actually taken that early anger among migrants in Canada at their situation and directed it against the British in India. They portrayed the government of Canada and the British government of India as two unjust regimes and both two sides of the same coin. So now on to the activities of the party following its formation in 1913. And a key contribution of the party in its early stages, and arguably its biggest contribution, was that of literature. At various stages, the party is involved in the production of at least 22 different newspapers and 22 different pamphlets, 14 papers, including writings from white Americans who were actually supporting the Gadar party in its activity, as well as numerous pieces of poetry which encouraged revolt against the British. Now, the most influential of these pieces of literature was the newspaper called the Gadar, from where the popular name of the party actually comes. The Urdu form of the newspaper was released in November 1913. Now, I assume most of us can't read Urdu, so thankfully a Punjabi version of the newspaper also rolled off the press a month later. To be entirely correct, the picture that I've presented here is actually not of the first Gadar newspaper. It's of volume 13, and it comes from March of 1914, but it still helps us to see numerous aspects of the paper. And I apologize in advance if it's difficult for you to read all the different features of the paper, but we'll work our way down. So starting off at the top, you'll notice that it actually says, "Joto prem khelan ka chao, sir tar tali gali meri aao," which is a line from Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Bani, which translates to, "Those who wish to play the game of love, come down my path, prepared to put your head on your hand." So really, this is the line which actually starts off every Gadar party newspaper, known as the Gadar. Now, it's a very inflammatory and revolutionary line, which really does not seek to hide what they are trying to do here. And on that pattern, if we come down the paper, we see these lines. So it says, "Angrez the Vari Hafte Var Urdu Gurmukhi Akhbar." So once again, the opponent of the British, published weekly in Urdu and Gurmukhi newspaper. Well, you have to think about the fact that this newspaper was as equally as easy to get into British hands as it was to be distributed around the Indian community. So the effect that this would have had on the Gadar party would have been enormous, but they did not care essentially about this, and they were happy to publish such openly revolutionary writings. And as if this wasn't enough, the next thing to consider are these 14 points. So this section is titled "Angrez Raj da Kacha Chitta," essentially translating to an open letter about the British Raj. These are written by Lala Hardayal. They appear on the title of every newspaper titled The Gadar, and they highlight how British Raj in India has decimated India. There are translations available, but in the interest of time, I'll leave you to all to search them. The last thing to mention are the details of the actual party. So you'll see a mention of the secretary, Yugantar Ashram, which is the other term for 436 Hill Street, San Francisco, California. Now, in addition to Gadar, there are numerous other newspapers prepared by the party, and unfortunately we can't go through them all in the interest of time. But for those who are interested, I would direct your attention to this resource. The South Asian American Digital Archive has copies of papers one can read from front to back online It is a wonderful resource. Other useful things that they have include the official letterhead of the party, so the Hindustan Gadar Party located at 5 Wood Street. Papers like the Independent Hindustan, which are written in English and are available cover to cover, and the United States of India, which came up later on, but is also written in English, and one can actually read cover to cover online at this web address. Now, continuing on this theme of the early Gadar party activity, we encounter the poetry of the party. The most prominent poems of the party can actually be found in this publication titled Desh Bhagtan Di Bani Gadar Di Gunj. So effectively, the hymns of revolutionaries, the thunder of Gadar, the thunder of revolution. The poetry itself is academically divided into 5 main topics, and we can have a read of these. They do help to enforce what the party was all about, but reading them is not going to have the same effect as actually reading the poetry. So let's bring in a few poems and have a listen to the sort of revolutionary writing that was taking place in the party at this time. Now, in the absence of an audience, I will actually be reading these for you, but I apologize in advance if my pronunciation or recitation does not actually capture the emotion of the writing. So here's the first. So if we continue down the Punjabi line, you can also have a look at the English translation. Hind de saputro karo ਧਿਆਨ ਜੀ ਲੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਤੇ ਹਿੰਦ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਵੈਰਾਨ ਜੀ ਤੁਸਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਵੀਰੋ ਖਾਣਾ ਜੰਗੀਆਂ ਖਾ ਲਿਆ ਮੁਲਕ ਲੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਫਰੰਗੀਆਂ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਅਤੇ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੂਰਮੇ ਕੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਬਣਾਓ ਵੈਰੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਚੂਰਮੇ ਫੜ ਲਓ ਸ਼ਤਾਬੀ ਹੱਥੀਂ ਤੇਗਾਂ ਨੰਗੀਆਂ ਖਾ ਲਿਆ ਮੁਲਕ ਲੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਫਰੰਗੀਆਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਨਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੂਰਮੇ ਮੈਦਾਨੀ ਗੱਜਦੇ ਕਿਉਂ ਨਾ ਪੀ ਕੇ ਰਤ ਗੋਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਰੱਜਦੇ ਗੱਡ ਦਿਓ ਲੜਾਈਆਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਾਲ ਝੰਡੀਆਂ ਖਾ ਲਿਆ ਮੁਲਕ ਲੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਫਰੰਗੀਆਂ. So very openly insightful, very inflammatory sort of poetry being produced at this time. The second poem to consider refers more to the notion of ethnic hatred that they felt in Canada, as well as nostalgia for Punjab. So going once again, ਘਰ ਤੋਂ ਬਗੈਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੱਜਦੇ ਕੁਲੀ ਕੁਲੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਜੱਗ ਵੱਜਦੇ ਘਰ ਸਹੁਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਢੋਈ ਮਿਲਦੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਪੇਕਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਣ ਥਾਣ ਕਿਧਰੇ ਦੇਸੋਂ ਪੈਣ ਤੱਕੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਮਿਲੇ ਢੋਈ ਨਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਪਰਦੇਸੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਦੇਸ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ. And one more to have a look at, just to reinforce their ideas. This one refers more to Sikh ideology and brings out other aspects of the Gadar party writing. So this actually starts off with Bhagat Kabir Ji's Salok. It's a poem titled Panth Age Pukar. And Salok ko Sura so pehchaniye jo lade deen ke het purja purja kat mare kabhu na chhade khet. And so the poem starts Paropakar kita guna sajyasi hati kite si jang kamal singho ਭਾਰਤ ਵਰਸ਼ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ੁਲਮ ਹਟਾਇਆ ਸੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਕਰਕੇ ਜੰਗੋ ਜਮਾਲ ਸਿੰਘੋ ਐਸ ਹਿੰਦ ਦੀ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਕਰਨ ਖਾਤਰ ਵਾਰ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਸੀ ਜਿਗਰ ਦੇ ਲਾਲ ਸਿੰਘੋ ਜੰਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾ ਗਏ ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਦੋਂ ਸੱਦਿਆ ਆਪ ਅਕਾਲ ਸਿੰਘੋ ਸਿੰਘ ਨਾਮ ਤਰੀਕ ਦੀ ਲਾਜ ਰੱਖੋ ਭਾਰਤ ਵਰਸ਼ ਤੇ ਖੇਡੋ ਗੁਲਾਲ ਸਿੰਘੋ ਛੇਤੀ ਗਦਰ ਮਚਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਕਰੋ ਤਿਆਰੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਦੇਵ ਸੀ ਤੁਸਾਂ ਅਕਾਲ ਸਿੰਘੋ. And this poem itself actually brings us to another point of contention and discussion on the Gadar party, which is the relationship between religion and the Gadar party. Was religion instrumental to the Gadar movement? And the answer to this seems to divide historians. View number one says that really it was, and this alludes to the fact that the movement itself was heavily reliant on Sikh philosophy, on institutions like gurdwaras, which became the hub of activity, and it was heavily reliant on Sikh history, with Sakhis of early gurus featuring heavily in their poems and writings. In fact, as Bushignani and Indra state, that really no sooner had the first issue of Gadar rolled off the press than revolutionaries were reciting poetry from Gadar at Vancouver Gurdwaras. So the Gurdwara becomes a key part of the movement. The opposing view to this really is that the majority of the Gadarites were self-professed atheists and secular. This is a quote which tends to do the rounds to do with Son Singh Bhakna, and it's said to come from his memoirs, where he writes that at this time we were not Sikhs or Punjabis, our religion was patriotism. In the writings of Lala Hardayal, it actually becomes even more clear. He's often accused as being a little bit all over the place in his philosophy, and it's probably because of this that historians have described him in sequence, somewhat confusingly, as an atheist, a revolutionary, a Buddhist, and a pacifist. But in his writing, Gulami da Zahar Ik Tabri Ki Lekh, written in Punjabi and Urdu in 1919, Lala Hardayal is quite critical of religious institutions in India, because he argues that every religion, without exception, actually has a hierarchical structure in which some people will sit at the top and receive the respect of those below. And this hierarchical structure is what made the British so able and made it so easy for them to slot in at the top of this structure and so therefore command the respect of everyone below them, essentially being all of India. The interaction between religion and Gadar is a question that I'll really leave you to think about for yourselves more and to read about and to make up your own mind on. But going back to the literature, the effect of this writing is immense. It ends up being translated into a variety of different subcontinental languages, finding its way all around the world and ultimately back into India. Khushwant Singh notes that it pretty much permeated down to the level of every village in rural Punjab. And most concerningly for the British, what this meant was that it was turning Sikhs from loyal British subjects into ardent revolutionaries. So as we continue this Gadar story, we encounter a somewhat shameful incident in Canada's history, which can really be seen as a turning point in the Gadar movement. We already know that the Gadarites ultimately aimed to make their movement violent, to take these blood and rifles and to overthrow the British in India, and this incident became a major trigger for that shift in their policy. So the next question is really to think about the name of this ship. And the usual answer to this is the Komagata Maru, but it's actually a slightly trick question. The Komagata Maru arrived in Canada in May of 1914. This ship is actually another Japanese cargo ship refitted to carry passengers referred to as the Panama Maru, which arrives in Canada in 1913. Now, the special thing about this ship is that it actually managed to abide by all those tough laws which we mentioned, which were designed to prohibit Indian migration into Canada. So even though 39 of these passengers are arrested, in all the subsequent legal battles that which continue, they actually end up being released because they haven't broken any laws. They've managed to come to Canada in one journey from India on tickets which were purchased in India, and they all have the $200 which they need to get into Canada. Their arrest is really because the government does not know what to do with them at this stage. This incident really for the Canadian government spells disaster because it shows the insufficiencies in their policy towards migration. And their subsequent steps essentially shut down Canadian ports to Indian migration. And it's in this sort of a situation where the Komagata Maru actually arrives in Canada. Now, it would be worth talking a little bit about the Komagata Maru here because it has such a significant impact on the Gadar movement. So the Komagata Maru is the name of a Japanese cargo vessel which was chartered by Gurdeep Singh, a wealthy fisherman in Singapore, who actually aimed to transport Sikhs waiting in Hong Kong, Shanghai and Singapore to Canada. And he receives a charter of this ship on March the 25th, 1914. Now, he had travelled to Hong Kong and he'd seen the situation of Sikhs in limbo, and so he actually clearly outlines why he did this in the ship's log. He was quite affected by the situation of people waiting to move to Vancouver, and so he himself resolves to get them there under any circumstance. So we can actually put the incidents of the Komagata Maru on a timeline. So let's look closely at this. Gurdeep Singh assumes proper control of this ship on the 25th of March 1914. By the 30th of March 1914, a telegram has been sent to Canada from the Hong Kong administration to confirm that the ship will not face any challenges from Canadian immigration legislation and so will be allowed to dock in Canada. But no reply is received. A subsequent telegram also goes unanswered. On the 4th of April 1914, the ship and its passengers are cleared to leave Hong Kong harbour, but are still waiting for a reply from Canada. On the 7th of April 1914, a reply does finally come from Canada, which confirms that the ship will not be allowed to dock, but it's unclear whether this reply actually gets through to the ship or not from the Hong Kong authorities. So while from here we see a number of different official communications being recorded between the Government of Canada, the British Government of India, and the Government of Hong Kong, which warned the Canadians of the impending arrival of this ship. The ship does arrive in Vancouver Harbour on the afternoon of the 21st of March 1914, where it's actually immediately refused to dock and quarantined. The official reason given for quarantine at this time is that the passengers did not receive security clearance in Japan prior to arrival. And this seems like a very arbitrary, a very unnecessary sort of rule which they've made up at this time. And it highlights the Canadian government's approach to what is really quite a shameful incident in their history. What really transpires from here over the next 2 months or so can only be described as shambolic. The Canadian government does not provide any clear reason as to why the ship is not allowed to dock. In fact, it's accused of making up delays, of making up technical difficulties, of even putting forward deliberate obstructions to intensify the misery, suffering and destitution of the 376 passengers aboard the ship, the majority of whom are sick. Now, this is where their intentions actually start to come clear. The government, through Hopkinson, one of their intelligence officers, actually learns of the charter terms of Gurpreet Singh. Now, I apologize, there are quite a few words on this slide, but just bear with me, let's go through this. Gurpreet Singh had been obliged to pay the sum of $15,000 for the charter of the Gomagata by the June the 15th, 1914. Without payment, the ship would forcefully have to be returned to Hong Kong. In his writing, Hopkinson actually reveals that it became the government's policy to deliberately delay by any means any attempt to resolve the ship's situation and to try and maximize the possibility that their state would pass without a resolution. Medical examinations, which should have been taking hours and days, begin to take weeks and months, and Gurpreet Singh himself is forced to remain on the ship, so he has no way of talking to the local Sikh population, referred to as the Hindus here, and he has no way of doing business with the banks, and therefore he cannot raise the $15,000 he needs to raise. The legal challenges which ensue about the Gomagata Maru would really make up their own presentation. But to briefly cover them, the major arguments put forward to the government were formulated by Gurpreet Singh, who argues that the Indians, and particularly the Sikhs on board, are British subjects and therefore have every right to enter into Canada. The government's response really is not cohesive, and they change it to suit their purposes at that time, because of course they do not have a clear policy to deal with this situation. Now, ultimately, all challenges which are put forward in front of the courts in Canada are dismissed. The courts uphold the right of the Government of Canada to control its own immigration, and the ship ends up being expelled from Vancouver Harbour with the assistance of the Navy on the 21st of July 1914. Only 20 passengers from the ship are admitted into Canada, and the reason for this is that they've been to Canada before. Now, for the remainder, for almost 2 months, they remained on the ship with a lack of provisions and a lack of medical care, looking into Canada essentially just like it's shown on the picture. Now, the ship is forced to return to India. It's not allowed to dock in Hong Kong or dock in Calcutta where they think they'll be docking. Instead, they dock in a nearby harbour known as Baj, where a subsequent incident known as the Baj massacre occurs, which is a great topic of reading for anyone who's interested and also has a significant impact on the Gadar Party movement. Now, this event, the return of the Gomagata Maru, coincides with another significant event in world history at this time. That is the outbreak of World War I, and these two together become significant turning points in the history of the Gadar movement. It starts to move very quickly from its focus on literature and producing inflammatory and insightful writings to its initial goal of seizing a moment to foment an armed revolution in India. Unfortunately for the majority of Gadar Party leaders, their view of how supportive the average Indian was and how supportive the soldiers of the army were to an armed revolution against the British could not have been more wrong. To illustrate this, let's trace back the stories of some of the Gadarites following the Gamagata Madhu's return out of Canada. So Sawn Singh Bhakna, you'll recall, was the president of the Gadar party at its formation. Sawn Singh Bhakna actually meets the Gamagata Madhu on its return voyage in the Japanese port of Yokohama. At this stage, he's said to have with him 200 automatic pistols and 2,000 rounds of ammunition ready to go for the purpose of trying to incite an armed revolution in India. Unfortunately, in a pattern which seems to be identical among many Gadarites, the scheme is foiled and he is arrested on return to India in October of 1914. In the subsequent 1915 Lahore conspiracy case, he ends up being trialed. He's sentenced to death, which is later commuted to life imprisonment. He ends up spending a number of years in prison up until 1947. Now, the second case we can have a look at, Kartar Singh Sarabha, he returns to India in 1914, where he actually finds that Gadar Party intelligence, which suggested a significant degree of support among rural India for the Gadar Party movement, could not have been more wrong. In fact, the majority of India at this stage is interested in supporting Britain in its aim to try and defeat the Germans in World War I. Now, Kartar Singh Sarabha ultimately ends up being forced to engage in a number of different robberies. He robs banks, trains, wealthy individuals to try and maintain the finances of the Gadar Party. He is ultimately arrested and he ends up being sentenced to death in the 1915 Lahore conspiracy case. And when he is hanged to death, at the tender age of 19, he becomes the youngest revolutionary to die in the struggle for Indian independence. Now, wave after wave of Gadar Party leaders returning to India at this time, some count suggesting up to 70 of them, including Baba Jawahar Singh, are arrested, they're tried, and many of them end up being hanged or imprisoned. Others, like Lala Hardayal, move to other parts of the world in centres of activity such as Berlin, where Lala Hardayal tries to continue to use German government support and funding to train soldiers and to ship arms back to India to support this armed revolution. But the effect of this is that it creates a vacuum of leadership in North America, and really that Gadar Party that we talked about and the Gadar that we grow to respect now enters into a period of free fall. In the absence of senior leadership, the reins fall in February of 1916 to Chandrakant Chakravarti, who at best is described as a passive follower and at worst is described as being corrupt and using Gadar Party funding from Germany for his own purposes. And historians almost uniformly agree that he wasn't exactly leadership material. The membership of the party at this stage, who remains in the US, enters into a phase of widespread bickering between each other, and they have numerous attempts of failed arms smuggling into India, which are all foiled by the British intelligence services. By now, the Gadar Party in India is actually the Gadar Party in the US is demonstrably collaborating with Germany during World War I. Now, even though the US hasn't entered into World War I yet, collaborating with Germany against the British violates the neutrality of the US and so therefore is a crime. And because of these reasons, they're under the strict surveillance of British, American and Canadian intelligence services. And really, in this sort of a climate, it's no wonder that the Gadar Party begins to crumble. And this is where we reach the final chapter within the scope of this presentation. On April the 16th, 1917, 17 Gadarites and 18 German consular staff are arrested, and they're charged with violating the neutrality of the United States by plotting against Britain on the territory of the States with the support of Germany. They end up being tried in what becomes known as the infamous Hindu-German conspiracy trial of 1917, which takes place in San Francisco. Somewhat luckily for us, the court documents of this trial actually reveal a lot of what we end up knowing about the Gadar Party. The trial should really be remembered for the widespread white American support for Gadar, the fact that they end up quoting American revolutionaries to justify their actions, and so force the judge to give them really small sentences, things like 2 months, 3 months in jail, nothing compared to the deportation that the British are calling for. But what the trial really ends up being remembered for is an incident which is documented in the New York Times. Ram Singh, an accused in the trial on the last day of hearings, actually stands up and shoots Chandrakant Chakrabarti for his alleged corruption while in the courthouse. Ram Singh himself is shot by the court-martial and also dies. The remnants of the Gadar party in North America at this stage actually enter into a phase of infighting and bickering, which lasts some time. Most historians would agree that the Gadar party does fail to play any useful role in Indian history after about 1919. This doesn't mean that the party is disbanded. In fact, they continue to produce literature throughout the 20s and 30s. They are involved in little incidents here and there, which I encourage you to read about, and they're formally disbanded at independence in 1947. But one question we have to consider before we finish is, did they achieve what they set out to achieve? If we think that the aim of the Gadar party was to ignite an armed uprising of the masses in India, then really in one short answer, they did not achieve this. Historians would agree that the Gadar party's contribution to independence in India, in their own words, is really not spectacular. There's a number of reasons as to why they failed to foment such an armed uprising of the masses in India. Firstly, they lacked pretty much everything at a planning level which they would need for such an armed uprising, including money, military leadership, arms, training, intelligence, and coordination. In addition, the British intelligence services were always one step ahead of the Gadarites. They set a number of traps for them, for which they fell hook, line, and sinker. Every attempt at arms smuggling or at training of soldiers for such a revolution was foiled by these intelligence services. The final criticism of the party is reserved for its structure, which has been described as being weak and on security grossly negligent. By the end, the party really becomes spread too thin, too far around the world. They have no secret way of communicating, and they become far too easy to monitor for intelligence organizations. There are records of them openly writing letters to British soldiers which end up falling in the hands of their seniors. There's also a record of this British mole or inside man actually finding his way into the inner circle of the party within a week of his admission, so they're not very secretive about who they allow in. So if it didn't achieve its goal, did the Gadar party achieve anything? And well, the answer to this is a resounding yes. Gadar became an expression of the plight of the exploited and discriminated immigrants in Canada. It shed light on migrant struggles, and it remains a fantastic story of the fight for ethnic identity and belonging. Its legacy for Canada is significant. It ultimately paved the way for the rebuke of the continuous passage law, the $200 required sum, and it allowed family migration to commence following 1947. Numerous subsequent revolutionaries were inspired by the writings of the Gadar party, including Bhagat Singh. For us, essentially as first and second generation migrants, or the children of first and second generation migrants, there's much to learn from Gadar. It's learning which has the potential to inspire and motivate all of us to challenge the injustices around us, no matter how inbuilt they may seem. But it's learning which we can only appreciate if we learn our Ithaas. Now, on that note, I'd like to end this talk. If that was a little bit too long for you to focus on, just remember that this isn't Gadar, this is Gadar. We've only just scraped the surface here. There is so much more to learn about the Gadar party, and here are a few topics which I hope will help in your further reading. Here are some suggested resources for everyone. This presentation will be up on our Facebook page. If you haven't already liked the page, please get on it. You can find us at Ithaas Empower the Future. This is the link, or just search for us on Facebook. You'll find a number of different useful and similar resources on that page as well. Just like always, we do have time for questions and feedback. Always, you've got my email. It comes with this presentation. Or just send us a message on the Ithaas Empower the Future Facebook page. We anticipate that everything that we've got here is factually correct, but if we've made a mistake, we do apologize. We do appreciate your feedback. We value it dearly. So please, if you have any feedback about the way this was run or the research or the way that we're going about things, please let us know. It's greatly appreciated, and we can incorporate it into our subsequent presentations. We're also always keen to get new people involved. If you've got a recommendation for a topic or would even like to give a talk, let us know. It's a fantastic way to learn history and acquire some public speaking skills on the side. And on that note, I thank you everyone for listening. Good night.